Hi everyone, welcome back to another week of No, It's Not Just the Weather. I am Carlota and I'm here with Ada and Alfredo.
Hi.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about, as you may already have seen in the title, climate change accountability. How should the weight of the responsibility of dealing with the effects of climate change be distributed? Do we focus on polluters? Should those who benefit from polluting actions do most of the heavy lifting? We're going to be focusing on environmental ethics, explaining to you the different ethical arguments surrounding the ongoing debate and their implications, and trying to answer some of the questions I just asked you.
So, environmental ethics, what is it? This branch of ethics focuses on the relationship between humans and the environment, along with its value and moral status. It follows the rationale that we, as humans, have a moral responsibility towards all natural elements, as our survival is linked with it. It is clear that climate change creates a misbalance in the lifestyle of the human race. Another justification that is used by environmental ethicists is a right-based approach and can be seen from multiple angles. On the one hand is the negative human right approach, in which humans have the right not to be subjected to the action of another person or group. Another one is the one that considers all the human rights that cannot be fulfilled living under the effects of climate change. And finally, it's the one that looks at the rights of future generations. Following this train of thought, it is clear that we should take action in avoiding climate change. This is not where the debate lies, but it is on how to do it justly. How do we motivate change, and how do we put it in practice? The debate focuses on mitigation and adaptation strategies to, for example, reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
So, what needs to be considered? Firstly, no country can deal with climate change alone. Only a shared response, where everyone takes the actions necessary, will be sufficient enough to deal with the problem. Secondly, climate change affects poor and other already vulnerable communities disproportionately, making them less able to mitigate and adapt. But the focus of people who study the ethics is how to make sure that those who lack economic and social resources that already face many injustices are not further damaged by climate change, and those that are already vulnerable are protected, that their rights to develop and carry out fulfilling lives are not compromised due to mitigation policies or abusive strategies in the name of reducing emissions. Well, the key ethical question is who should bear the burden of these costs, not only in economic terms. Who should be required to cut back emissions, and on what grounds? How can a fair model be developed that recognizes historical and current beneficiaries and that does not unreasonably prevent the development of those who, as yet, have benefited very little?
Well, to try and answer all of these very important questions, different authors have come up with different arguments and different theories, and now we're going to explain the most relevant to you. First, we have the one which is called equality of burdens, which basically treats all actors equally and distributes the load evenly between them. So this has equality as the main principle, and it is the approach that was taken with the Kyoto Protocols from 1997. However, this has been deemed problematic by some authors, where they state that to treat actors equally is to treat them unjustly. For example, Mollendorf says that it doesn't take into consideration the historical background of injustice, that it doesn't respect the right of development because it requires underdeveloped countries to pay costs that may stall their growth in order to maintain the high standards of living of developed countries. And with this, the reduction of emissions falls differently on different parts of the population. For the rich, it might seem significant to reduce all of these emissions, but they will probably be reductions in their luxuries. Meanwhile, for the poorest population, these reductions will probably entail a loss of essential livelihoods. So while it upkeeps equality, you can see how it might not be the best approach. Then, also of the line of upkeeping equality, we have equal shares. This is a model that assigns a per capita quota of emissions that a country can generate. So it distributes the same share of emissions to all, therefore, everyone has to have the same reductions. This model poses an advantage over the equal burdens one because it gives some space of growth to the poorest countries that don't really use all of their entire quota. And also with it, there is some accommodation to the right of development, and it allows emissions permits for trading with those states that emit less than their target. So, this allows richer states to buy additional emission targets, which is arguably more efficient and less difficult at cutting emissions. In addition, it also benefits poor states by making their lack of emissions a source for revenue.
Now, as a second perspective, we can mention the polluter pays, which is a perspective that states that since some countries have historically contributed more to global warming than others, these countries have the follow-up responsibility now to do more to address climate change. It is a reparative principle. This reparative principle seeks to lay the responsibility on those who caused the damages. It puts a financial responsibility in the same place as the moral responsibility. If we consider countries to be agents that are responsible, then it is likely that the wealthier countries would be responsible for the cost of financing mitigations and adaptations to climate change. For the most part, it is the wealthy countries that have been the polluters and also the beneficiaries at the expense of low and middle income countries. So you can start seeing what could be perceived as an injustice to some. So what are some difficulties? What are some disadvantages with this perspective? Well, there is first and foremost the problem of uncertainty. Estimating all the effects of climate change with the necessary accuracy for this model can be extremely difficult, making it also very difficult to then declare who caused which harm to the extent of putting an exact price on these damages. Second, are polluters responsible for the damage before it was known that such actions contributed to climate change, or only for pollution since around the 1990s when it began to be known that carbon emissions contributed to climate change? This is a question that sort of remains unanswered. This burdens present-day individuals with the actions of their predecessors, and there can be, therefore, an unfairness objection to this perspective. Now, to make polluters responsible for effects that they can reasonably be said not to have known about seems unjust. And this reduces the intuitive appeal to fairness that is such a strength in this principle. Therefore, that leaves the ground open for the concept of excusable ignorance.
Well, similar to polluter's pay principle, there is beneficiary pays. And this principle holds those who have profited from the economic development that has driven climate change responsible for addressing its impacts. It doesn't necessarily mean that these beneficiaries had anything to do with causing the pollution. Basically, those who benefit from projects that increase global warming and spoil the environment are liable to pay for making things right, or for reparations to those harmed by those projects. If a developed nation currently benefits from a huge power plant built by older generations who weren't aware of the extent of its environmental consequences, they still owe reparations to those who suffer these effects. This way, excusable ignorance is no longer an excuse for taking this approach. It makes it possible to establish progressive systems where people pay according to their means. So the richer pay more because it wouldn't lead to having to compromise vital resources, like unequal burdens. For example, there are proportional income taxes to fund the restoration of national parks. But let's not forget to mention some difficulties with the implementation of this principle. Well, to put it into perspective, if A causes some environmental injustice from which both A and B benefit equally, they should be held accountable. But how do you distribute the liability? Well, according to the principle equally, but that doesn't really seem fair, right? Well, we face many more of these scenarios where it becomes even more complicated and impractical to implement. We deeply have this entrenched view in society that those who harm have the moral obligation to address it.
Yeah, and then a bit related to the impractical element that you were just discussing, we have the ability to pay principle, which basically suggests that the burdens of climate change should be carried by the wealthy and in proportion to their wealth. This argument has gained popularity lately because of the pressing need to address climate change. There is no point arguing about historical injustices and attributing blame if those identified are rather unable or unwilling to pay. So, this approach is way more pragmatic. It considers those who can afford to finance the necessary policies and changes. However, this approach has also faced some criticism, and its main problem is that it does not seem fair. Why should having the resources to pay for mitigations and adaptation strategies of climate change should make it your responsibility to pay? It is not a principle that is operated in other areas of justice, and it lacks the intuitive appeal of fairness that both polluter pays and the beneficiary pays principles have. But if those who have the resources to do it do not pay, then who will? Doing nothing has consequences, and it is the most vulnerable who will bear the greatest burden if there's no action taken.
So, to start wrapping this up, I think we could go again briefly over all the main perspectives that we have covered. Perhaps the first one is the equality of burdens, where all actors are treated equally and the load is distributed evenly among them. Then there is the equal shares, which is pretty similar. It's another equality-based approach, but this allows for a bit more freedom, especially with the per capita quotas that can to some degree be exchanged. Then there is a bit of a more like a shift of perspective with the polluter pays, which sees the responsibility of who has contributed more to global warming, to climate change, and assesses responsibility using that principle. Then the beneficiary pays, it's again similar to the previous principle, to the polluter pays, but this one focuses more on who has profited from the economic developments due to climate change. So it goes a little bit further down that chain of things that have happened. And finally, is the ability to pay principle, which just focuses a lot more on who is now with the economical capacity to carry out the actions that must be done to address the burdens of climate change. So I think that to some extent this can be seen as a spectrum. Yes, there's a theory behind all of them, but there is also the possibility to slightly move between all of them. So maybe one idea that we could propose would be a hybrid approach, and maybe even a mobile approach that, depending on the circumstances that are being faced both by countries, both by, let's say, a global community, that can be thought of in regards to how we face the issue of climate change, then we could move along that spectrum depending on what the moment is actually calling for, and not just staying with a strict and rigid ideologic position.
Yeah, we would adapt it to the current capabilities, right?
Exactly.
I think finding the middle ground is the key here.
Yes, definitely. But I also think this goes along with, we have to be pragmatic, because we have been seeing all along our podcast, there is deep urgency for taking climate action right now at a global scale. So I think that the ability to pay approach, I think this is not the best one in the sense of the more just or equal, but I think the one who would help us solve our problems in the most efficient manner. And as we have covered at the beginning of the episode, it is also a moral obligation to solve climate change. So I think, while also we need to take into consideration the context of each situation, I think having this approach of ability to pay would be the best way of tackling climate change, in my opinion.
As usual, if you are interested in this subject, you can find all of our sources quoted in the description. If you have any questions to us, please don't hesitate to text us on No It's Not Just the Weather on our Instagram or TikTok account. You can also send us an email at noitsnotjusttheweather@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on other social media platforms. And thank you so much for listening.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.